date was February the 3rd, 1926. The place, downtown Pensacola, where at last, after weeks of anticipation, WCOA radio was to begin actual broadcasting. WCOA, which stood for Wonderful City of Advantages, had already made 2 brief test broadcasts to be sure the $3,500 worth of used equipment functioned properly, and it did. The studio for the new station was in City Hall, where a large horn-type speaker had been installed on the roof, so that listeners who had no radio sets of their own could come into Plaza Ferdinand and hear the broadcast. The 250-watt signal was to be sent out from 2 100-foot towers erected behind City Hall. The tuning point on primitive radio dials was 252 meters. Actually, there are 2 reports on when the first broadcast actually boomed forth. One put it at 8:30 a.m., while another said it at 7 p.m. Both, however, agreed that the initial sound was a duet sung by Anita Villar and Johnny Frankel, the city clerk, who also was billed as the breezy boy of the Gulf. The pair sang Down Pensacola Way, written 2 years earlier by another Pensacolian, Perry Reed. Incidentally, that song also closed the first broadcast. A small chorus sang songs, and city officials commented on what radio was going to mean to the city. The new studio was not large, but it contained a baby grand piano, a phonograph, and several stand-up microphones. Soon after going on the air, the station published a schedule which announced that it would broadcast Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays starting at 8 p.m. with weather reports daily at 10:30 a.m. and 12:30. Church services would be aired each Sunday evening at 7:25. Soon, the station's power would be up to 500 watts, and the value of the operation would be emphasized by its weather reports, which were treasured by farmers, and the warnings which appeared in advance of the 1926 hurricane, and which were credited with saving many lives. John Frankel, who loved to perform, would remain a fixture on the station for many years, and happily, one recording of his voice has survived, and it sounded like this.Radio 1926 on WCOA. It began in a simple second-story studio in City Hall on a station supported by city revenues and dedicated to home entertainment and information. The operations, about 3 hours per day, 3 days per week at first, had no national affiliations and no primary broadcast sources. Everything, at first, had to be homemade. Fortunately, Pensacola was going through the throes of a boom in small orchestras and dancing, and had many qualified instrumentalists and singers. Oh, and incidentally, virtually all of these performed on WCOA without pay. Some of the bands played to help promote money-making dances they staged at popular ballrooms, and their performances on the air would range from 30 minutes to an hour, interspersed by commentary, news, and frequently guest vocalists. The Fairchild Orchestra, the Florida Foot Stompers, the Clutter Conservatory Band, Tony Bruno's Varsity 8, the George Evans Band, and the Eddie Collins Rainbow Orchestra were typical of these performers. Vocalists included Collins, Tony Viscuso, Eddie Bonifay, an executive from Fisher Brown, Gene Villar, Tony Bruno, Frank Marchese, and more. Frank Howland, an outstanding banjoist, would appear regularly, as would pianist Peggy Stearns. Later, when broadcasting extended to longer daytime hours, Gloria Gailey, a talented organist, would be piped in from the great Robert Morton organ in the Sanger Theater. Miss Gailey was perhaps the best remembered of all these artists. George Ellis, who played piano with the Varsity 8, would also solo on WCOA, and he went on to an advertising career with the local newspapers. What did they play? Well, just about everything. Jazz, ragtime, New Orleans-style blues, semi-classics, and the so-called old favorites. This early broadcasting preceded the big band era and its tunes, but the presentations were enjoyed by an audience which expanded several times in the first 5 years. WCOA was here, it was experimenting, it was doing what other local stations were doing nationwide, giving local talent a chance to perform. In 1991, when radio receivers have become technical works of art, usable from the living room or automobile to the jogger's pocket, it's difficult to appreciate how this universal instrument might have looked and worked in the beginning. But it wasn't always an easily available, relatively inexpensive instrument. The first sets enjoyed by most Americans, and Americans were definitely the first users, was the personally assembled crystal set, which used the simplest principle to receive the faint signals being sent out by early stations. However, the crystal set was not to survive for long. By 1925, tinkerers could buy components for assembling their own receivers. They used early vacuum tubes and diodes, and while they might still employ earphones as the crystal set required, many now added what was called a horn, a large speaker from which the famed RCA trademark was copied. The horn directed sound and soon became the centerpiece in many a living room, a gathering place for the whole family. But the early component receiver had a drawback. It often lacked power to pull in a continuous signal. Thus, many venturesome fathers added a new touch. They erected a pole in the backyard and strung a wire from the receiver to the pole's top, thus giving them an antenna. Usually, this worked well, sort of. But even before the decade of the 20s was gone, commercial companies such as Stromberg Carlson were producing custom sets which could also be handsome pieces of furniture. Soon, names like Philco, Emerson, Spartan, and Gruno were available, and by 1928, the first electrified combination radio phonographs were being produced. But they were not inexpensive. Even into the Depression times, a quality radio was priced in the same range as a fine television set today. Many early models were consoles standing high, often on handsomely machined legs, but there were tabletop models too, in round-top designs that endured into the 1940s. By 1932, radio makers were advertising their power, usually in terms of the number of tubes involved, and by then had become a hobby for listeners to test how distant a signal they might bring in, usually late at night. Yes, the early radios were instruments of pleasure, of pride, and surely of information and entertainment. They changed the way of living, day and night, for millions of Americans, bringing the world closer as WCOA did for Pensacola. Radio on WCOA. It began small in 1926, counting on local formatting and local talent, but by the early 1930s, things had changed radically, and part of that change came because of the habits of the homemaker. In the 1930s, virtually no women worked outside the home. Their activities, laundry, ironing, cleaning, cooking, childcare, and more, could be programmed to a time schedule, and radio broadcasters in New York and Chicago recognized that the programs produced by newly formed networks and piped to local outlets like WCOA could be beamed at times which fit the plans of the homemaker and mother, and that's exactly what they did. Thus was born a long series of shows, each usually 15 minutes long, broadcast at a given time 5 days per week. The daytimers, often sponsored by the makers of household products such as laundry soaps, thus took on a nickname, soap operas, and in short order, their audiences were in the millions. Radios were positioned near ironing boards, kitchen sinks, or where mother might darn stockings from her sewing basket. Some shows were action-styled, but most dealt with lives and problems that gave the ladies escape, especially in those bleak Depression times. What did the shows sound like? Here are a few beginnings.
And now, Stella Dallas, the true-to-life sequel as written by us to the world-famous drama of mother love and sacrifice. In my beautiful memory. The story of Mert and Marge. Mert and Marge is a story of Broadway, a story that goes beyond the lights of the gay white way into the lives of two chorus girls. Two girls from the cast of that most glittering of all Broadway extravaganzas, Hayfield's Pleasures. The house lights go down, the footlights come on. In a moment, the curtain will go up on the first chapter in the story of Mert and Marge.
WCOA's schedule in those times might include 6 such programs in the morning and another 4 in the afternoon hours, interspersed with news, weather, and local commentary, and we'll be recalling some of this in later anniversary shows. But the daytime soaper was an art form unto itself, copied for children in the late afternoon and then giving way to longer family shows at night. It was radio's first golden hour, and it lasted until television changed part of the way in which people live and work. It's difficult difficult to believe that radio as a communications tool for the family is so young. And yet, as you listen today, it is just over 70 years since the first formal broadcast was heard, bringing election returns which told of Warren Harding's victory to a few radio hobbyists near Pittsburgh. Yet, in the years that followed, radio as an instrument blossomed. Listeners were few, for most had literally to build their own sets and then sit straining as crackling signals were heard through primitive earphones. Most of the first stations broadcast just a few hours a day, as WCOA did, and the programming was almost totally in terms of news, basic community reports, or readings. At the beginning, there was no advertising, and for almost a decade, a debate would rage as to whether commercial messages should be allowed. Yet, few things have descended upon the home more quickly than radio. By 1926, when WCOA went on the air, despite the relatively high price of commercially produced sets by Emerson, Stromberg, Carlson, and Majestic, family members sought out this new adventure. In some cases, Pensacola included, families consented to have their homes wired for electricity for the first time so that signals could be brought in, though in more remote areas, early radio sets were battery-operated using large storage batteries. Quickly, the formatting of broadcasts changed, with personalities who had become well-known on the stage and in the infant motion picture industry being used. Often, their voices were on records that played over the air. One such example that was played over WCOA featured Will Rogers.
Now, folks, all I know is just what little news I read every day in the paper. Everybody's talking about what's the matter with this country and what the country needs. What this country needs worse than anything else is a place to park your car.
This then was Radio 1926, as this new medium was about to become part of the scene in Pensacola. When WCOA went on the air in 1926, virtually no one in Pensacola thought that soon this new form of communication might change the way young children lived, thought, or were informed. But radio did just that. And by the early 1930s, the lives of youngsters from age 6 and up had been altered by program schedules and the adventures which radio brought them. The concept that did this was the 15-minute drama. It began in 1931 with a program called Captain Tim's Stamp Club, created by the fertile mind of a marketing executive for Procter & Gamble, the makers of Ivory soap. The idea, as it evolved, was to bring to radio a program that school teachers would endorse. And what better way to make youngsters study geography than by having them become interested in collecting postage stamps from around the world? And that's what Captain Tim offered, a daily 15-minute program which told of faraway places in exotic terms, and then offered the listeners an opportunity to get a stamp collector's album, and then, one after another, packets of stamps from those countries. Kids sent 2 soap wrappers and a dime to the captain, and then waited anxiously for their stamps. And when they came, oh my, how the stamp clubs and discussions in class proliferated. That was the beginning. Soon, others followed. One that became a legend was the ongoing daily adventures of Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy, a New York State schoolboy and detective whose adventures featured the voice of Jim Amici, the younger brother of Don Amici, who became a star in his own right. Here's how those daily adventures began, sponsored by Wheaties.
The all-American boy.
Wave the flag for Hudson High, boys. Show them how we stand. Ever shall our team be champions, known throughout the land.
Wheaties, breakfast of champions, bring you the thrilling adventures of Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy.
There were others, too, of course. Little Orphan Annie, whose stories followed the comic strip character, Ben Potter, the boy detective, Terry and the Pirates, and more, all fit into an hour and a half each afternoon. It was radio at its finest for the kids who seldom missed an exciting episode. And those hours full of adventures set the scene for the same listeners to enjoy radio with the grown-ups a little later each day. Radio's first decade moved through several programming stages very rapidly, for the original producers were quick to discover that people would listen if they were to be entertained or informed. First broadcasts would seem stiff and formal today, for they were partly stand-up readings of ticker-tape news. But personalities from the local communities became involved for commentary or to report on affairs of the area. By 1926, when WCOA began, stations were adding formal studios for musical groups who would broadcast live. By the late 1920s and early 30s, The concept of shows which might be created in major studios had arrived, though this was still before what we now know as networks. The radio drama and then the variety or comedy show developed around the availability of large phonograph records. Remember, this was still in the day of the 78 RPM turntable. Thus, a recording of more than 3 minutes required both a sizable turntable and a very large diameter record. Once this technical hurdle had been overcome, the way was open to prepare and copy dramas which could be shipped to stations all over the country. The first of these dramas were for daytime listening and usually were 15 minutes in length. Actually, the drama was shorter, for the 15-minute time segment allowed for commercial messages, which might be also pre-recorded and sent to the stations or which could be inserted by local personnel. The radio drama took many forms, and it was here that the so-called soap opera, so named because sponsors were frequently the manufacturers of laundry products, was born. Usually these ran 5 days per week, 15 minutes per day, and were positioned one after the other, beginning about 9 in the morning. A typical program of that time sounded like this.
For Young's Family. The story of your friends, the Youngs, is brought to you by Cam-A, the mild beauty soap for a smoother, softer complexion.
The daytime 15-minute show quickly proved that radio dramatics could be moved to a higher level, and so longer 30-minute or even 60-minute shows came into being. As WCOA's anniversary continues, we'll bring back memories of those broadcasts, programs created for women, for children, and for the entire family, too. In the beginning, WCOA was a new medium of radio entertainment. It seemed a miracle that voices could, with the flip of a switch and the turning of a dial, be brought from far away into the family living room where several generations gathered to see what might be heard next. But by 1928, the opportunities which radio represented were mushrooming. The value to the public furnished by WCOA when it warned of the oncoming hurricane in 1926 caused hundreds to spend what seemed large sums to have radio in the home. Radio now meant entertainment, fun, information, news, and then, slowly, perspectives on what was happening. Early news happenings were not broadcast here live from other parts of the land. That would come in the 1930s. But recorded events did help make people appreciate what was possible and help them get to know personalities that would impact their lives. Here, for example, is what Herbert Hoover told his countrymen on record in the summer of 1928 when he accepted the nomination for the presidency.
We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation.
Hoover's statement prompted newswise people in the nation's capital and other big cities to be alert to opportunities where men and women of note might be quoted and then rebroadcast. This was a beginning that would help chart the way for later coverage of news, which itself did not come full-blown internationally until the days when World War II began. WCOA was 3½ years old when financial calamity struck the United States. No record survives of what local announcers told the people here on October 24, 1929, but surely they made comment. This was still prior to the time when the station's personnel might call a network affiliate or special news service to gain supplementary details. For the most part, they had to rely on the same sources which furnished the local newspaper, and then to make their own reports, which often were much longer than today's newscasts. In 1929, however, there were analysts who foresaw what was happening and tried to both help the growing roster of stations and to make their own reputations. Such a man was historian Frederick Lewis Allen. Allen drafted his views and recorded them, hurrying them to stations by mail, hopeful that the station management would use the material and then send the suggested price for the transcription. This was what Allen told America over stations such as WCOA just following the Great Crash.
There was a sudden stampede to get out from under. At 10-minute intervals, the bond ticker over in the corner of any branch broker's office would hammer off a list of selected prices direct from the floor, and a broker's clerk would grab the uncoiling sheet of paper and read the figures aloud in a mumbling, expressionless monotone to the white-faced men who occupied every seat on the floor and stood packed at the rear of the room. One saw men looking defeat in the face. One of them was slowly walking up and down, mechanically tearing a piece of paper into tiny and still tinier fragments. Another was grinning shamefacedly, and still another was sitting motionless, his eyes fixed blindly upon the moving figures on the screen. That meant the smash-up of the hopes of years.
The stock market crash of 1929 was no single event. In the days that followed, markets went up and down, and then gradually settled lower and lower, wiping out the investment and savings of millions of Americans. These were still days when WCOA was owned by the city of Pensacola and broadcast from City Hall. By 1931, however, the cash-strapped city felt that it could no longer afford the cost of operating a non-commercial station. Thus, WCOA was sold to John C. Pace and other investors. This was the first great change in the life of the city's first station, a change that led to a new location and a new operating format. WCOA's second owner was financier John C. Pace, who, along with other investors, had acquired the station from the city of Pensacola. Pace moved the station from City Hall to the 7th floor of the San Carlos Hotel. Details of that studio and how it operated will be heard in another broadcast later. For our purposes here, the second major change was to make WCOA a truly commercial station, accepting advertising. Of course, that was assuming in 1931 that there were firms with dollars to spend. The station also improved its entertainment format, for now there was a large studio which could accommodate bigger bands and orchestras such as the Varsity 8. Yet there was another string to WCOA's new bow. Times were bad, and with the shutting down of mills, farms, and factories elsewhere, families were streaming toward Pensacola, hoping for work or even food. One WCOA news story disclosed that the new community chest had been forced to close down, its work taken over by a few philanthropists such as Carl Weiss, J.H. McCormick, and John Sherrill, who, along with the Rotary Club and the Sisters of Charity, did what they could to help. As all of this was occurring here, there were serious efforts by organized groups elsewhere to get help from the federal government. One such group was the Organized Veterans of World War I, who chose to march on Washington. This news story, carried by the station, told how serious things had become.
What common impulse moved these men almost simultaneously in Harlem and Salt Lake City, on the Texas plains, and in the Chicago flop houses? There is one. The men have been out of work for a long time. This bonus march might well be described as a flight from hunger, from the cries of the starving children, from the harsh rebuffs of prospective employers.
Day by day, WCOA tried to help, sending forth appeals, reporting on the miseries that occurred when people were forced to live in cardboard Hoovervilles. The success of advertising sales was very limited, but there were some. Fisher Brown, the motion picture houses such as the Isis and Sanger, and Sears Roebuck tried out the new medium. It was Depression time, but for many Pensacolians there was one bright spot. Their new radio station brought news, information, and many forms of entertainment, and people loved it. WCOA was still in its infancy when so-called national programmed radio came into being. At first, the programs utilized the obvious, with half-hour evening shows sponsored by big-name businesses and utilizing an art form which could be quickly transferred from stage to radio, and that, of course, was music. By 1929 and 30, such stalwarts as the A&P Gypsies and the Clico Club Eskimos were national favorites. Clico Club, incidentally, was one of that era's most popular families of soft drinks. And of course, musical shows continued through radio's golden age with artists like Bing Crosby and Benny Goodman's Swing School capturing large audiences. But it wasn't long before drama captured radio imagination. At first, the series were adaptations of classic characters. Sherlock Holmes, for example, starring Richard Gordon, played successfully for 3 years, and Nick Carter the Detective, long a pulp magazine favorite, was quickly transferred to the airwaves. But there were more serious forms, too. One was directed by famed movie producer Cecil B. DeMille, and it began its weekly hour-long performances like this.
Presents Hollywood. The Lux Radio Theater brings you Rita Hayworth and Charles Corbin in This Love of Ours. Ladies and gentlemen, your producer, Mr. William Keeley.
The Lux Radio Theater was a favorite, and not far behind was another weekly classic that popularized both its format and the little character who introduced it, and sounded like this.
Johnny presents the Philip Morris Playhouse, produced, edited, and directed by William Spear. Tonight's star, Marlena Dietrich.
Yes, radio drama became one of the great favorite pastimes of the 1930s. No wonder WCOA's listeners flocked to their speakers every night and made this station part of their lives. As WCOA emerged as a strong station in the beginnings of radio, its managers experimented with format. For even when there was little competition, it did make a difference to know how many folks out there were listening. The same kind of experimenting was going on in the great centers where syndicated programs would soon be produced. And this often meant rapid transition for the men and women whose names would be remembered as the stars. Take Marion and Jim Jordan, for example. They appeared on WCOA first in a half-hour comedy program that ran late on Saturday afternoons. The performers were simulated kids who were part of Carlton Meyer's kindergarten. The kindergarten didn't last long, but the Jordans did. Their second effort would play for a decade and would always be remembered because of its unique closet. Weekly, that program commenced like this.
The Johnson Wax Program with Fibber McGee and Molly. The makers of Johnson's Wax products for home and industry present Fibber McGee and Molly with Bill Thompson, Gail Gordon, Arthur Q. Bryan, Jess Kirkpatrick, and me, Harlow Wilcox.
In the 1930s, Americans also loved stories of the West, as attested to by the success of basic two-reeler films. There weren't too many successful Western radio shows, but one still will never be forgotten. It was a weekly half-hour show, and it came on like this.
Horse for the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty hi-yo, Silver, the Lone Ranger.
When the western United States were first opened to settlers, the promise of easy wealth brought both honest men and criminals to the new territory. Both found that wealth could only be purchased by hard work, and the criminals returned to their old habits. The masked rider of the plains fought them tirelessly, however. Astride his great horse Silver, he rode through the length and breadth of 7 states in the cause of justice. And in time, he brought law and order to the lawless frontier. Return with us now to those thrilling days when the West was young and adventure lay at the end of every trail. The Lone Ranger rides again.
Come on, Silver! Outlaws are near Carter City! Santa's waiting in the trail ahead! Hi-yo, Silver! Away!
The Lone Ranger and Tonto would have their transitions, too, for several men went on to play the lead. But the Ranger, advertising Silver Cup bread, became a tradition, and WCOA was part of it in those golden days. As WCOA came on the air in 1926, the nation was passing through its most extravagant period of prosperity, but soon would fall into the valley of depression. Depression was serious business. Thousands, then millions, lost jobs, and even vintage establishments closed their doors. It was a time of stark tragedy for many whose lives were shaped by these times. Life was hard. Is it any wonder that comedy on radio became a source of solace? And it did. It was in the evening hours that the great comedy stars emerged. All were new to America, though a few like Eddie Cantor made the transition from the stage. Some appeared in simple, homey series, while others built a format that included gags, music, and banter between the comic and his foils. One of the simpler stories that appeared 3 evenings a week for 15 minutes was taken from the backwoods of Arkansas, a little town called Pine Ridge, and it always began like this.
Air, a division of General Motors, presents a brand new comedy show with Miss Edna Best, Andy Devine, Miss Zazu Pitts, music by Opie Cates, and starring Lum and Abner.
Lum and Abner was one style. Others like George Burns and Gracie Allen were far different. Burns, who still survives as a comic in his 90s, was the straight man for the witless Gracie, and their weekly show commenced like this.
Well, Gracie, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everybody. What do I do now?
Well, just make something up, you know.
Oh, all right. I'll make up a riddle. I'll give you 3 chances, and if you can't guess it, you win.
If I can't guess it, I win? Well, what happens if I guess it?
Well, then it's a tie.
It's a tie?
Now, what's the difference?
Just a minute, Gracie. This one is on me. A fellow was in a restaurant. He ordered spinach, mashed potatoes, and cheesecake. How did I know that he was a soldier?
Oh, is that the one where the fella had on a uniform? Yeah, that's very good, George. Tell us.
Yes, comedy was part of life in the 1930s because Americans needed that regular dose of revival medicine. WCOA was the doctor, and people never forgot it.